Hello, gentle listener, and welcome to another quiet look into the past. In tonight's story, we'll journey to a world that is familiar in its humanity, but very distant in time. Perhaps you're listening as your day winds down, or maybe your eyes are already getting heavy. However you arrived here, I'm glad you did. I always love to hear where you're joining from and what time it is in your part of the world. The thought of this quiet story traveling across the globe is truly wonderful. If these peaceful trips through history help you find a moment of calm, I invite you to follow along. We have many more journeys planned for the nights to come. In this series, we're going to uncover the hidden daily lives of ancient Egyptians, from the poorest farmer to the richest merchant. We'll find out what they ate when they woke up, how they managed their private moments, what a typical workday looked like, and how they had fun after sunset. What makes this so special is the incredible detail. I've spent months digging through archaeological finds, ancient scrolls, and tomb art to build the most accurate picture possible of life in ancient Egypt. And by the end, I think you'll see that they faced many of the same challenges we do, just with more crocodiles and far less technology. First, to give you an idea of how specific we can get, we know the exact time most Egyptians got out of bed, what they used instead of a toothbrush, and even how they handled office drama that makes modern workplace politics seem tame. So, let's begin our day just as an ancient Egyptian would. At sun. Imagine it's around 1550 BCE, and the first light of the sun is starting to appear on the eastern horizon. For most Egyptians, this wasn't just the start of a new day. It was the daily rebirth of their sun god. Missing this event wasn't really an option. Unlike us, with our blaring alarms and snooze buttons, ancient Egyptians lived in a natural rhythm with the sun that would feel almost foreign to us now. The typical Egyptian family resided in a house made of mud brick, cleverly designed for the desert environment. These weren't the giant stone structures you see in documentaries. Instead, they were practical homes with flat roofs used as outdoor living areas, thick walls to keep the inside cool on hot days, and small windows placed high up to catch breezes while blocking sand. As the sun rose, the first person up in the household was usually the woman. Now, before we assume this was due to an unfair social structure, the reality was much more practical. Women in Egypt often managed the family's money, ran their own businesses, and had considerable power in society. Rising early was simply a necessity because someone had to begin making the bread. And in ancient Egypt, fresh bread wasn't just a breakfast food, it was the core of every single meal. And this is where things get truly interesting, because the process of making that daily bread tells us so much about their society. First, the grain had to be ground using a stone quern, which was exhausting, back-breaking labor that could take hours. The grain was usually emmer wheat or barley, and the quality of your bread was a direct sign of your social standing. Wealthier families had servants perform this grinding, while poorer families had to wake up much earlier to finish the task before the day's heat became too intense. While the bread was being made, other family members would be starting their morning routines, which were nothing like ours today. Ancient Egyptians were surprisingly focused on cleanliness and personal hygiene, but they didn't have running water or modern plumbing. Instead, they used a system that was both ingenious and labor-intensive. Every morning, family members would wash using water stored in large pottery jars. This water had to be carried from the Nile or from local wells, and it was precious enough that every drop was used efficiently. They cleaned their teeth using frayed twigs, often from the Salvadora persa tree, which actually has natural antibacterial properties. Some wealthier Egyptians even had a kind of toothpaste made from ground pumice, salt, and mint. But perhaps most surprisingly, both men and women wore makeup every single day. And this wasn't just about vanity. The famous black coal eyeliner that we associate with ancient Egypt served multiple practical purposes. It helped protect their eyes from the harsh desert sun. It had antibacterial properties that prevented eye infections, and it was believed to provide spiritual protection from evil forces. The application of this makeup was actually a complex ritual that tells us a lot about Egyptian values. They used mirrors made from polished bronze or silver, and the wealthy had elaborate cosmetic sets with multiple containers for different substances. The kohl was made from ground galena or malachite, mixed with animal fat or oil, and applied with small sticks or brushes. Both men and women outline their eyes dramatically, often extending the lines beyond the natural eye shape in styles that varied by region and time period. Once the morning preparations were complete, it was time for the first meal of the day. And this is where we start to see the massive differences between social classes that defined every aspect of Egyptian life. For a wealthy Egyptian family, breakfast might include fresh bread, honey, figs, dates, cheese made from goat or cow milk, and even meat left over from the previous day. They might drink beer, which was actually safer than water and was consumed by people of all ages, including children. This beer was thick, nutritious, and had a relatively low alcohol content, making it more like a liquid bread than the beer we know today. But for a typical farming family, breakfast was far simpler. Coarse bread, perhaps some onions or garlic, and weak beer or water flavored with herbs. Meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions, and fresh fruits were seasonal treats rather than daily staples. However, regardless of social class, every Egyptian family faced the same challenge as the day progressed: the relentless heat of the desert sun. This shaped everything about how they structured their daily activities, and it created work patterns that were completely different from anything we experience in our modern climate-controlled world. Most outdoor work had to be completed in the early morning hours, roughly from sunrise until about a.m. As the temperature climbed, people would retreat to the coolest parts of their homes or find shade wherever possible. This wasn't laziness, it was survival. Working in the full heat of an Egyptian midday could literally be fatal, and everyone understood this fundamental truth. This brings us to one of the most important aspects of daily Egyptian life: their work. And contrary to popular belief, most ancient Egyptians weren't building pyramids. The pyramid building period was actually relatively short in Egypt's long history. And even during that time, the majority of the population was engaged in agriculture, crafts, trade, or various service industries that kept this complex civilization running. Let's start with the farmers who made up about % of the population. Their daily routine was entirely dictated by the annual flood cycle of the Nile River, which was so central to Egyptian life that their calendar was built around it. The year was divided into 3 seasons: Akhet, the flooding season; Per, the growing season; and Shimu, the harvest season. During Akhet, when the Nile flooded and covered the farmland with fertile silt, farmers couldn't work their fields. But this didn't mean they were idle. Many were recruited for public works projects, including the construction of monuments, temples, and yes, sometimes pyramids. Others worked on maintaining irrigation systems, preparing tools for the next planting season, or engaging in crafts that could be traded once the floods receded. When Per arrived and the waters receded, farmers faced an incredibly intense period of activity. They had to plow the mud-softened fields using wooden plows pulled by oxen, plant their crops, and then begin the constant battle against pests, weeds, and the ever-present threat of drought or unexpected flooding. But here's what makes Egyptian farming so different from what you might expect. These weren't individual family farms in the way we might imagine. Most farmland was owned by the pharaoh, temples, or wealthy nobles. The actual farmers were more like tenant workers or sharecroppers, owing a significant portion of their harvest to their landlords and to the state in the form of taxes. The daily life of a farmer during planting season started before dawn. After their simple breakfast, they would head to the fields carrying wooden hoes, sickles, and baskets. The work was backbreaking, breaking up clouds of earth, removing stones, planting seeds by hand, and constantly maintaining the complex network of irrigation channels that brought Nile water to their crops. Women often worked alongside men in the fields, especially during harvest time, but they also had specialized roles. Many were responsible for winnowing grain, separating the wheat from the chaff, using large baskets and the desert wind. Others managed the storage of harvested crops, which required extensive knowledge of how to protect grain from insects, rodents, and moisture. Children weren't exempt from this work either. As soon as they were old enough, usually around age or 6, they began helping with simple tasks like scaring birds away from crops or carrying water. By their early teens, they were expected to contribute significantly to the family's labor. But farming was just one piece of the incredibly complex economic system that made ancient Egypt function. In the towns and cities along the Nile, a completely different kind of daily life was unfolding, one that involved craftsmen, merchants, scribes, and service workers, whose routines were shaped by different pressures and opportunities. Take, for example, the daily life of a carpenter in ancient Thebes. His morning would begin much like the farmers, with simple food and the application of protective coal. But instead of heading to fields, he would walk to his workshop, carrying tools that were remarkably sophisticated for their time. Egyptian carpenters used copper and bronze chisels, saws, adzes, and measuring tools that allowed them to create furniture, boats, coffins, and architectural elements with precision that still amazes modern craftsmen. Their daily work involved not just the physical labor of cutting and shaping wood, but also the complex logistics of obtaining materials in a desert environment where good timber was often imported from Lebanon or Nubia. The social dynamics of these workshops were fascinating. Master craftsmen supervised apprentices in a system that was part education, part labor exploitation. Young boys would be bound to masters for years, learning not just the technical skills of the craft, but also the business relationships, quality standards, and artistic traditions that would allow them to eventually establish their own workshops. But here's what's really interesting about Egyptian craftsmanship. It wasn't just about creating functional objects. Every piece was expected to meet both practical and spiritual requirements. A carpenter making a chair wasn't just concerned with whether someone could sit on it comfortably. He also had to ensure that the proportions, decorations, and even the wood selection aligned with Egyptian beliefs about harmony, protection, and the connection between the physical and spiritual worlds. This spiritual dimension affected every aspect of daily work life in ways that might seem strange to modern people. Before beginning any significant project, craftsmen would often make offerings to Peter, the god of craftsmanship, or to other deities associated with their particular trade. The workshop itself might contain small shrines where workers could pray for protection from accidents or for inspiration in their work. The working day for most craftsmen followed a pattern similar to the farmers. Intense activity in the cooler morning hours, a long break during the heat of midday, and then a return to work in the late afternoon and early evening. But unlike farmers whose work was seasonal, craftsmen had to maintain steady production throughout the year to meet the constant demand for their goods. This brings us to one of the most important but often overlooked aspects of ancient Egyptian daily life: the incredible complexity of their economy and the role of trade in shaping individual routines. Egypt wasn't an isolated civilization living in splendid isolation along the Nile. It was actually the hub of an incredibly sophisticated trade network that stretched from Sub-Sahara and Africa to the Mediterranean, and from the Red Sea to the western oases of the Sahara. This meant that the daily lives of countless Egyptians were shaped by the constant flow of goods, people, and ideas through their communities. Consider the life of a merchant in ancient Memphis, one of Egypt's great commercial centers. His day would begin not just with the usual morning routine, but with a careful review of inventory, price calculations, and planning for the complex negotiations that lay ahead. Unlike modern commerce, where prices are fixed and transactions are standardized, ancient Egyptian trade was a highly personal, relationship-based system where every deal required extensive bargaining and social maneuvering. This merchant might be dealing with Nubian gold traders bringing precious metals from the south, Lebanese cedar merchants offering the high-quality timber that Egypt desperately needed, or local farmers bringing surplus grain to exchange for manufactured goods. Each transaction required not just business acumen, but also cultural sensitivity, language skills, and a deep understanding of the religious and social customs that governed different communities. But here's what makes Egyptian commerce so fascinating. They didn't use money in the way we understand it. Instead, they operated on a complex barter system supplemented by standardized units of value based on weights of copper, silver, or grain. A merchant's daily life involved constant mathematical calculations, converting the value of different goods into these standard units, and negotiating exchanges that satisfied all parties involved. The record-keeping alone was a massive undertaking. Egyptian merchants employed scribes to document every transaction, creating detailed papyrus records that had to account for quantities, qualities, dates, and the identities of all parties involved. These weren't just business records. They were legal documents that could be used to resolve disputes or collect debts, sometimes years after the original transaction. And speaking of scribes, let's dive into the daily life of perhaps the most envied profession in ancient Egypt. Becoming a scribe was one of the few ways for someone from a modest background to achieve real social mobility, and the training required was both grueling and transformative. A young scribe's day began with hours of practice copying hieroglyphic texts, learning not just the symbols themselves, but also the proper techniques for preparing papyrus, mixing inks, and maintaining the reed pens that were essential tools of the trade. This wasn't just penmanship practice. It was an intensive education in literature, mathematics, law, religion, and administration that could take a decade or more to complete. Master scribes worked in a variety of settings that shaped their daily routines in different ways. Some were attached to temples, spending their days recording religious ceremonies, managing temple finances, and copying sacred texts. Others worked for government administrators, documenting tax collections, legal proceedings, and official correspondence. The most elite scribes served in the royal court, where their daily responsibilities might include drafting diplomatic letters, recording the pharaoh's decrees, or maintaining the complex genealogical and ceremonial records that legitimized royal authority. But regardless of their specific role, all scribes shared certain daily challenges that were unique to their profession. They had to maintain their materials in perfect condition despite the harsh desert environment, protect their papyrus from insects and moisture, and ensure that their writing met the exacting standards expected in a culture where written records were considered to have magical as well as practical power. The social dynamics of a scribe's daily life were particularly complex because they operated at the intersection of different social classes. A scribe might spend his morning taking dictation from a wealthy noble, his afternoon mediating a dispute between merchants, and his evening teaching basic writing skills to the children of craftsmen who could afford private tutoring. This brings us to one of the most remarkable aspects of ancient Egyptian society: the role of women in daily economic life. Unlike many ancient civilizations, Egypt offered women substantial opportunities for economic independence and social influence. Though these opportunities varied significantly based on social class and family circumstances, wealthy Egyptian women could own property, run businesses, and engage in legal transactions with a freedom that wouldn't be seen in many other societies for thousands of years. A typical day for a prosperous merchant woman might involve supervising textile production in her workshops, negotiating contracts with suppliers, managing a staff of servants and workers, and maintaining the social relationships that were essential for business success. These women didn't just inherit their positions. Many built their wealth through their own entrepreneurial efforts. Some specialized in luxury goods like perfumes, jewelry, or fine textiles. Others operated taverns, managed agricultural estates, or ran the complex household operations that supported wealthy families. Their daily routines required the same skills as their male counterparts: mathematical ability, negotiation skills, cultural awareness, and the physical stamina to manage multiple responsibilities throughout long, demanding days. But even women from more modest backgrounds had opportunities that might surprise modern observers. Many worked as professional mourners, entertainers, or religious functionaries. Others operated small businesses from their homes, producing bread, beer, textiles, or other goods that they sold in local markets. The daily life of a working woman in ancient Egypt was shaped by the same environmental challenges that affected everyone else, but with the additional complexity of managing family responsibilities alongside economic activities. A woman running a small bakery, for example, would have to coordinate her bread production with child care, ensure that her ovens were properly maintained despite the scarcity of fuel, manage relationships with grain suppliers and customers, and maintain the quality standards that could make or break her reputation in the local community. Now, all of these economic activities were supported by an infrastructure that required its own army of workers whose daily lives were essential but often overlooked. The people who maintained Egypt's irrigation systems, transported goods along the Nile, operated the docks and warehouses, and provided the countless services that kept this complex society functioning. Take the daily life of a Nile boatman whose work was absolutely crucial for Egyptian civilization. His day would begin before dawn, checking his vessel for damage from the previous day's journey, loading cargo or passengers, and preparing for the complex navigation required to travel safely along a river that was simultaneously Egypt's lifeline and one of its greatest dangers. Navigation on the Nile required intimate knowledge of seasonal changes in water levels, shifting sandbars, dangerous currents, and the locations of the hippos and crocodiles that posed constant threats to river traffic. A boatman's daily routine involved not just the physical work of sailing, rowing, or pulling his craft, but also the mental challenge of reading the river conditions and making split-second decisions that could mean the difference between a successful journey and a catastrophic accident. The cargo these boatmen transported reveals the incredible diversity of goods that flowed through Egyptian society on a daily basis. A single boat might carry grain from Upper Egypt, gold from Nubia, cedarwood from Lebanon, incense from the Red Sea coast, and manufactured goods from workshops in Memphis or Thebes. The boatmen had to understand the specific handling requirements for each type of cargo, manage the complex logistics of multiple stops along his route, and maintain detailed records of what was loaded and unloaded at each destination. But the Nile wasn't just a commercial highway. It was also the primary means of personal transportation for most Egyptians. This meant that boatmen also served as passenger carriers, connecting families separated by distance, enabling pilgrimages to important religious sites, and facilitating the social interactions that bound Egyptian communities together. The daily social life of ancient Egyptians was far richer and more complex than most people realize. After the working day ended, communities came alive with activities that served both entertainment and important social functions. Evening gatherings were central to Egyptian social life, and they took many different forms depending on the season, the community, and the social class of the participants. In farming villages, people might gather in courtyards or on rooftops to share the day's events, tell stories, play games, and enjoy whatever entertainment was available. Music was an integral part of these gatherings, and it reveals fascinating details about Egyptian values and daily life. Musicians used instruments like harps, flutes, drums, and sirens to create music that accompanied singing, dancing, and storytelling. But this wasn't just casual entertainment. Music was believed to have spiritual power, and many of the songs that filled Egyptian evenings were actually religious hymns or magical incantations designed to provide protection, ensure good fortune, or honor the gods. Dancing was equally important, and it served multiple functions in Egyptian society. Some dances were purely recreational, allowing people to celebrate court potential partners or simply enjoy physical expression after long days of labor. Others were religious rituals that were believed to communicate with deities, ensure successful harvests, or protect communities from harm. Games were another crucial element of Egyptian social life, and the variety of games they played reveals a society that valued both intellectual challenge and pure fun. Senet, perhaps the most famous Egyptian board game, was played by people of all social classes and was believed to have religious significance related to the journey through the afterlife. But Egyptians also played simpler games that children could enjoy, as well as more complex strategy games that challenged adult players. These evening social activities weren't just entertainment. They were essential mechanisms for maintaining community cohesion, transmitting cultural knowledge from one generation to the next, and providing the social bonds that help people cope with the challenges of daily life in a demanding environment. But perhaps most importantly, these gatherings provided opportunities for the kind of informal education that was crucial for most Egyptians. Children learned about their culture, their history, and their place in society, not through formal schooling, which was available only to a small elite, but through the stories, songs, and conversations that filled their evening hours. The seasonal nature of Egyptian life meant that these social patterns changed throughout the year in ways that created a rich and varied community calendar. During the flood season, when outdoor work was limited, communities had more time for elaborate celebrations, extended storytelling sessions, and the kind of intensive social interaction that strengthened relationships and resolved conflicts. Harvest time brought different kinds of gatherings, often focused on cooperative work that required community coordination. These weren't just economic activities. They were social events that combined necessary labor with celebration, competition, and the reinforcement of social bonds that would carry communities through the challenges of the coming year. Religious festivals provided another crucial structure for Egyptian social life, creating occasions when entire communities would come together for celebrations that could last for days. These festivals weren't solemn religious observances in the way we might imagine. They were joyous community celebrations that combined religious devotion with feasting, music, dancing, and the kind of social interaction that was essential for maintaining the complex relationships that held Egyptian society together. The daily preparation for these festivals reveals another important aspect of Egyptian life: the incredible amount of planning and coordination required to make their society function. Organizing a major religious festival required months of preparation involving craftsmen who created decorations and ceremonial objects, farmers who provided extra food, musicians and dancers who prepared special performances, and religious officials who ensured that all the ceremonial requirements were properly met. This level of coordination was necessary for almost every aspect of Egyptian life, from the annual flood cycle that required community-wide cooperation to manage irrigation systems to the complex trade relationships that brought goods from across the known world to Egyptian markets. And this brings us to one of the most remarkable aspects of ancient Egyptian daily life: how they managed to create and maintain one of history's longest-lasting civilizations despite facing challenges that would seem insurmountable to modern people. The coordination required wasn't just impressive from an organizational standpoint, it was absolutely essential for survival. Without it, Egyptian civilization would have collapsed within generations rather than lasting for over years. And this brings us to perhaps the most underappreciated aspect of daily Egyptian life: the incredible sophistication of their problem-solving abilities. Every single day, ordinary Egyptians had to navigate challenges that would stump most modern people. They had to predict weather patterns without meteorology, manage complex agricultural systems without modern tools, maintain public health without understanding germ theory, and coordinate massive construction projects without computers, or even written mathematical formulas as we know them. Take something as basic as food storage, which was literally a matter of life and death in a civilization where a failed harvest could mean starvation for thousands of people. Egyptian families didn't just throw their grain into containers and hope for the best. They developed elaborate systems involving multiple types of storage, each designed for specific types of food and specific storage durations. They used ceramic jars sealed with beeswax and resin for liquids like oil and wine. They created underground storage chambers that maintained consistent temperatures despite the extreme heat above ground. They developed techniques for drying fruits and vegetables that preserve them for months without refrigeration. They even figured out how to store live fish in artificial ponds, creating a kind of ancient aquaculture system that provided fresh protein year-round. But here's what makes this even more remarkable. These weren't techniques developed by specialists and then distributed to the masses. These were skills that ordinary families passed down through generations, refined through trial and error, and adapted to local conditions. A farming family in Upper Egypt might have completely different food storage techniques than a merchant family in the Delta, but both systems would be incredibly sophisticated and perfectly adapted to their specific circumstances. The daily maintenance of these systems required constant attention and expertise. Women often specialized in food preservation, spending hours each day monitoring fermentation processes, checking stored goods for signs of spoilage, and adjusting storage conditions based on seasonal changes. This wasn't just domestic work. It was highly skilled technical labor that required deep understanding of chemistry, biology, and engineering principles that these people couldn't name, but absolutely understood. Men often focused on the construction and maintenance of storage facilities themselves, which required skills in masonry, waterproofing, ventilation design, and pest control that would impress modern contractors. They had to build structures that could withstand floods, earthquakes, extreme temperature variations, and the constant assault of insects and rodents that threatened stored food supplies. Children learned these skills through daily participation, gradually taking on more responsibility as they demonstrated competence. By the time they reached adulthood, they possessed a level of practical knowledge about food systems that far exceeded what most modern people understand about where their food comes from or how it's preserved. This same pattern of sophisticated problem-solving appears in every aspect of Egyptian daily life. Consider their approach to personal hygiene and healthcare, which was far more advanced than most people realize. Egyptians didn't just wash themselves. They had developed complex systems for maintaining cleanliness that addressed both practical and spiritual concerns. Their daily bathing routines involved not just water, but carefully prepared soaps made from animal fats and plant-based alkalis. They used different cleansing agents for different parts of the body, understanding that skin on the face required different treatment than skin on the hands or feet. They had specialized preparations for hair care that protected against the harsh desert environment while maintaining the elaborate hairstyles that were important markers of social status. But beyond basic cleanliness, Egyptians maintained daily health practices that reveal sophisticated understanding of preventive medicine. They used various plant-based preparations to protect against common ailments, maintained dietary practices that modern nutritionists would recognize as sound principles, and engaged in physical activities that were designed to maintain strength and flexibility throughout their lives. The daily routine of an Egyptian family included time for what we might call physical therapy exercises, though they wouldn't have used that term. People regularly stretched, engaged in strength training using their daily work activities, and participated in games and dances that maintained cardiovascular health and muscular coordination. Women often specialized in herbal medicine, maintaining gardens of medicinal plants, and preparing remedies that addressed everything from minor cuts and bruises to serious illnesses. Their daily routines included checking and tending these medicinal gardens, preparing and storing various herbal preparations, and maintaining the knowledge systems that allowed them to diagnose and treat health problems within their families and communities. The sophistication of their medical knowledge was remarkable. They understood the importance of wound cleaning and had developed antiseptic preparations that actually worked. They knew how to set broken bones, treat various skin conditions, and manage pain using plant-based medicines that contained active compounds similar to modern pharmaceuticals. But perhaps most impressively, they understood the connection between mental and physical health in ways that modern medicine is only beginning to rediscover. Their daily routines included activities designed to maintain emotional balance, social connection, and spiritual well-being. Recognizing that these factors were essential for overall health, this holistic approach to daily life extended to their work practices as well. Egyptian craftsmen didn't just focus on producing goods. They maintained work environments that supported both productivity and worker well-being. Workshops were designed to maximize natural lighting while minimizing heat exposure. Work schedules balanced intensive activity with adequate rest periods. Social structures within workshops provided support systems that helped workers cope with both professional challenges and personal problems. The daily life of a workshop supervisor reveals just how complex these considerations could become. He had to coordinate the technical aspects of production, manage relationships between workers of different skill levels, ensure that quality standards were maintained, handle the business relationships with suppliers and customers, and maintain the workshop facilities themselves. But beyond these obvious responsibilities, he also served as a counselor, mediator, and community leader. Workers brought him personal problems that affected their ability to work effectively. He had to balance competing demands from different customers while maintaining fair treatment for his workers. He served as a link between his workshop and the broader community, representing his workers' interests in community decisions and ensuring that his business contributed appropriately to community needs. This multi-layered approach to leadership was necessary because Egyptian society was incredibly interconnected. A problem in one workshop could affect suppliers, customers, and competitors throughout the community. A skilled supervisor understood these connections and managed his daily activities with awareness of their broader implications. The same complexity appears in the daily lives of religious officials who served functions that went far beyond what we might expect from modern religious leaders. A typical temple priest's day included not just religious ceremonies, but also administrative duties, educational responsibilities, and community service obligations that made him a central figure in local society. His morning routine began before dawn with personal purification rituals that were far more elaborate than those required of ordinary Egyptians. He had to maintain higher standards of physical cleanliness, follow stricter dietary restrictions, and engage in daily meditation and prayer practices that prepared him for his various responsibilities. But once these personal preparations were complete, his day became a complex juggling act between different roles. He might spend the early morning conducting religious ceremonies, the late morning teaching children basic literacy and numeracy, the afternoon mediating disputes between community members, and the evening managing temple finances and coordinating with other religious officials. The educational role was particularly important because formal schooling was available only to a small elite. For most Egyptian children, the local priests provided their only access to literacy, basic mathematics, and the kind of general knowledge that allowed them to function effectively in their society. This educational process wasn't just about transferring information. It was about maintaining cultural continuity across generations through daily interactions with children and their families. A Priests ensure that Egyptian values, traditions, and practical knowledge systems were preserved and adapted to changing circumstances. The daily teaching routine involved not just formal lessons, but also informal mentoring that helped young people understand their place in society and develop the skills they would need as adults. A priest might spend part of his day teaching a future scribe how to prepare papyrus, part of his day helping a young craftsman understand the religious significance of his work, and part of his day counseling parents about how to guide their children's development. But perhaps the most crucial aspect of a priest's daily life was his role in maintaining the complex religious systems that provided the spiritual foundation for Egyptian civilization. This wasn't just a matter of conducting ceremonies. It required deep understanding of theological principles, astronomical observations, mathematical calculations, and the kind of organizational skills needed to coordinate religious activities across multiple temples and communities. The daily maintenance of these religious systems reveals just how sophisticated Egyptian civilization had become. Priests had to track multiple calendar systems simultaneously, coordinate their activities with agricultural cycles and political events, maintain accurate records of religious obligations and ceremonial requirements, and ensure that religious practices remained consistent across vast distances and long periods of time. This level of coordination was possible only because Egyptian society had developed incredibly effective communication systems that allowed information to flow rapidly across the entire kingdom. The daily life of a royal messenger provides insight into how these communication networks actually functioned. A messenger's day began with careful preparation that was essential for both personal safety and message security. He had to plan his route based on current conditions along the Nile, seasonal variations in travel conditions, and political circumstances that might affect his safety in different regions. The physical demands of his work were enormous. Depending on the urgency of his message and the distance he had to travel, he might spend days traveling by boat, on foot, or using donkeys or other pack animals. He had to navigate not just geographical challenges, but also the complex social and political relationships that determined how he would be received in different communities. But beyond the physical challenges, messengers carried enormous responsibility for maintaining the information systems that held Egyptian civilization together. They transported not just official government communications, but also personal letters, business documents, religious instructions, and the kind of informal information that allowed widely separated communities to coordinate their activities. The daily routine of preparing, protecting, and delivering these messages required skills that combined physical endurance with intellectual sophistication. Messengers had to be able to read and write, understand the political implications of the information they carried, maintain absolute discretion about sensitive communications, and adapt quickly to changing circumstances that might require them to alter their plans or find alternative routes. Their work also required deep cultural knowledge that allowed them to function effectively in communities with different customs, dialects, and social structures. A messenger traveling from Memphis to Aswan would encounter dozens of different local communities, each with its own particular characteristics. And he had to understand how to approach local leaders, follow appropriate social protocols, and avoid misunderstandings that could delay his mission or even put him in danger. This cultural sophistication was necessary because Egyptian civilization wasn't as uniform as we might imagine. While there were certainly shared values, religious beliefs, and social structures that unified the kingdom, there were also significant regional variations that reflected different environmental conditions, economic specializations, and historical experiences. The daily life of people in the Delta region was shaped by different challenges and opportunities than those faced by people in Upper Egypt or Nubia. Coastal communities had access to Mediterranean trade networks, but had to deal with different security threats. Desert oasis communities had developed specialized techniques for managing scarce water resources, but had limited access to some goods that river communities took for granted. These regional differences created opportunities for specialization in trade that enriched Egyptian civilization, but they also required sophisticated coordination systems that could manage the complexity without losing the benefits of diversity. The daily routines of local administrators reveal how this coordination actually worked at the practical level. A provincial governor's day involved balancing local needs with national requirements, managing relationships between different communities within his jurisdiction, coordinating with other governors to address regional challenges, and maintaining communication with the royal court that kept central authorities informed informed about local conditions. His responsibilities included everything from tax collection and legal dispute resolution to infrastructure maintenance and military recruitment. But perhaps most importantly, he served as a cultural bridge between local communities and the broader Egyptian civilization, ensuring that regional variations remained within acceptable bounds while allowing communities to adapt Egyptian institutions to their particular circumstances. This balancing act required enormous skill and constant attention to changing conditions. A governor had to understand not just the formal requirements of his position, but also the informal relationships and cultural dynamics that actually determined how effectively he could accomplish his goals. His daily routine included formal meetings with local officials, informal conversations with community leaders, personal interactions with ordinary citizens who brought him their concerns and complaints, and private time for planning and reflection that allowed him to stay ahead of developing problems. But beyond these obvious duties, he also had to maintain his own household, manage his personal relationships with family and friends, and participate in the social and religious activities that were essential for maintaining his standing in the community. The daily life of a high-ranking official wasn't just about exercising power. It was about maintaining the complex web of relationships that made effective governance possible. This same pattern appears throughout Egyptian society, whether we're looking at farmers, craftsmen, merchants, priests, or government officials. Their daily lives involved far more complexity and sophistication than we might expect from people living thousands of years ago. They had developed social institutions, economic systems, and cultural practices that allowed them to create and maintain one of history's most successful civilizations. They solved problems that would challenge modern societies, adapted to environmental conditions that would defeat less organized communities, and maintained cultural continuity across centuries of change and challenge. And they did all of this while dealing with the same basic human needs and desires that we face today: the need for food, shelter, and security, the desire for meaningful work and social connection, the challenge of raising children and caring for aging parents, and the universal human quest for purpose and meaning in daily life. The daily routines we've explored reveal people who were remarkably similar to us in their fundamental humanity, but who had developed very different solutions to the challenges of creating successful, sustainable communities. Their approaches offer insights that remain relevant today, reminding us that there are many different ways to organize human society and many different definitions of what constitutes a good life. As we continue our exploration of ancient Egyptian daily life, we'll discover even more surprising details about how these remarkable people managed to create a civilization that lasted for over 3 millennia, adapting and evolving while maintaining its essential character through periods of prosperity and crisis, expansion and contraction, innovation and conservation. The evening hours in ancient Egypt revealed perhaps the most intimate and fascinating aspects of daily life, when the crushing heat finally subsided and communities came alive with activities that would surprise anyone who thinks these people lived simple, primitive lives. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Egyptian families didn't just collapse from exhaustion after their demanding days. Instead, they participated in a rich social world that was both deeply practical and surprisingly sophisticated. Picture a typical evening in a middle-class neighborhood along the Nile around BCE. As the temperature finally dropped to bearable levels, courtyards and rooftops throughout the community began filling with people engaging in activities that served multiple purposes simultaneously. This wasn't just leisure time. It was when the real business of maintaining social relationships, educating children, and preserving cultural knowledge actually took place. Food preparation for the evening meal was a community affair that reveals incredible details about Egyptian social structures and values. Unlike our modern world where families eat in isolation, Egyptian evening meals were often shared events that involved multiple households, extended family members, and even neighbors who contributed different elements to create elaborate communal feasts. The process of preparing these evening meals required coordination that would impress modern event planners. Different families specialized in different aspects of the meal preparation, not just because of resource limitations, but because this specialization created social bonds that strengthened community resilience. One family might be known for their exceptional bread baking, another for their skill with vegetables, and another for their ability to prepare meat in ways that maximized both flavor and preservation. Women often took the lead in coordinating these meal preparations. But this leadership role extended far beyond simple cooking. They managed complex social negotiations about who would contribute what, how resources would be shared, and how the resulting feast would be distributed among participants. These negotiations required diplomatic skills that would be impressive in any context because they had to balance practical considerations with social relationships, economic realities, with cultural expectations. The actual cooking process was a technological marvel that most people completely underestimate. Egyptian cooks didn't just throw ingredients together and hope for the best. They had developed sophisticated techniques for controlling heat, managing cooking times, and combining flavors that created dishes far more complex than the simple bread and beer diet that most people associate with ancient Egypt. Their ovens were engineering marvels designed to maintain consistent temperatures despite limited fuel supplies and extreme environmental conditions. They understood fermentation processes that created not just bread and beer, but also cheeses, preserved vegetables, and fermented sauces that added variety and nutrition to their diets. They had developed spice blending techniques that used locally available herbs and imported aromatics to create flavor profiles that were both delicious and medically beneficial. But perhaps most remarkably, they understood food safety principles that protected them from the foodborne illnesses that could devastate communities without modern medical care. They knew which combinations of ingredients provided natural preservation, which cooking techniques eliminated dangerous bacteria, and which storage methods prevented spoilage in hot, humid conditions. The evening meal itself was a carefully orchestrated social event that served functions far beyond simple nutrition. The way people were seated reflected social hierarchies, but also provided opportunities for mentoring relationships between older and younger community members. The order in which different dishes were served created natural conversation rhythms that allowed for the sharing of information, the resolution of conflicts, and the maintenance of social bonds that held communities together. Children weren't just passive recipients of food during these evening gatherings. They were active participants in elaborate educational processes that transmitted everything from practical skills to cultural values. While adults were eating and talking, children were learning about food preparation, social etiquette, economic relationships, and the complex web of obligations and opportunities that would shape their adult lives. The stories told during these evening meals weren't just entertainment. They were sophisticated information management systems that preserved historical knowledge, technical expertise, and cultural wisdom in ways that made them memorable and personally meaningful. A story about a clever farmer who outwitted a dishonest merchant wasn't just amusing. It taught practical lessons about commercial relationships, negotiation strategies, and ethical principles that listeners could apply in their own lives. Religious stories served similar educational functions, but they also provided emotional and psychological support that helped people cope with the challenges and uncertainties of daily life. Stories about gods overcoming obstacles, heroes persevering through difficulties, and communities surviving disasters provided both practical guidance and emotional reassurance that strengthened individual resilience and community solidarity. Music during these evening gatherings reveals another layer of sophistication that most people never consider. Egyptian musicians weren't just playing random tunes to provide background entertainment. They were performing complex compositions that served multiple functions simultaneously, creating emotional atmospheres that enhanced social bonding while also transmitting cultural information and providing opportunities for individual expression. The instruments themselves were technological marvels that required sophisticated understanding of acoustics, material science, and manufacturing techniques. Harps had to be constructed with precise tension systems that maintained proper tuning despite extreme temperature variations. Drums required carefully prepared animal skins that produced specific tonal qualities while withstanding constant use. Flutes and other wind instruments demanded precise measurements and finishing techniques that created accurate pitch relationships and pleasing timbres. But beyond the technical aspects, Egyptian music served psychological and social functions that were essential for community well-being. well-being. Different types of music were used to create specific emotional states that served therapeutic purposes, helping people process grief, celebrate achievements, manage anxiety, and maintain the emotional balance necessary for effective functioning in challenging environments. The dancing that accompanied this music wasn't just physical entertainment. It was a complex communication system that allowed for the expression of ideas and emotions that were difficult to convey through words alone. Different dance forms served different social functions, from courtship rituals that helped young people form appropriate partnerships to religious ceremonies that maintained spiritual connections to competitive displays that established social hierarchies without resorting to violence. Children learned these dance forms through daily participation, gradually mastering not just the physical movements, but also the cultural meanings and social context that made dancing an effective tool for community building and personal expression. By adulthood, most Egyptians possessed a vocabulary of physical movement that allowed them to participate in complex social interactions that strengthened community bonds while providing outlets for individual creativity. Games played during these evening hours reveal another dimension of Egyptian sophistication that challenges our assumptions about ancient life. These weren't just simple diversions to pass time. They were educational tools that taught everything from mathematical concepts to strategic thinking, from social skills to ethical principles. Board games like CET weren't just entertainment. They were sophisticated simulations that helped players understand complex concepts about probability, planning, and decision-making under uncertainty. The religious symbolism embedded in these games provided opportunities for discussing spiritual concepts in ways that were both intellectually engaging and emotionally meaningful. Physical games and competitions served similar educational functions, while also providing the exercise and skill development that were essential for survival in a physically demanding environment. Wrestling matches, running competitions, and various ball games weren't just fun. They were training systems that maintained the physical fitness and competitive skills that individuals needed to succeed in their daily work and contribute effectively to community defense. But perhaps most importantly, these games provided opportunities for social interaction across age groups and social classes in ways that strengthened community cohesion while allowing for the peaceful resolution of tensions and conflicts that might otherwise disrupt social harmony. The evening hours also provided time for the maintenance and creation of the material objects that made Egyptian daily life possible. This wasn't just busy work to fill idle time. It was essential economic activity that required sophisticated skills and careful coordination between different community members. Women often spent evening hours engaged in textile production that was far more complex than simple weaving. They had to process raw materials like flax and wool using techniques that required deep understanding of fiber properties, chemical treatments, and mechanical processes. They operated looms that were engineering marvels capable of producing fabrics with complex patterns, varying textures, and specific performance characteristics suited for different purposes. The designs they created weren't just decorative. They were information systems that communicated social status, regional identity, religious beliefs, and personal achievements in ways that were immediately recognizable to other community members. A skilled textile worker could look at someone's clothing and immediately understand their occupation, their family background, their economic status, and their role in the community's social structure. Men often used evening hours for tool maintenance and creation that was equally sophisticated and equally essential for community survival. They had to maintain metal tools using techniques that required understanding of metallurgy, heat treatment, and precision shaping that would impress modern craftsmen. They created wooden implements using carpentry skills that combined artistic sensibility with functional excellence and durability requirements. But beyond these obvious practical activities, evening hours provided time for the kind of innovation and experimentation that allowed Egyptian technology and culture to evolve and improve over time. Craftsmen used their leisure time to experiment with new techniques, test different materials, and develop improved tools and methods that enhanced productivity and quality in their daily work. These innovations weren't just individual achievements. They were community resources that were shared through informal networks that connected craftsmen across different specialties and different regions. A carpenter who developed an improved joint technique would share that knowledge with other woodworkers who would adapt and refine it further, creating a continuous improvement process that strengthened the entire technological base of Egyptian civilization. The evening hours also provided opportunities for the kind of personal relationships and individual development that were essential for psychological well-being and social stability. Courtship rituals weren't just romantic diversions. They were complex social processes that helped young people form partnerships that would contribute to community strength and individual happiness. These courtship processes involved elaborate systems of gift exchange, artistic performance, and social interaction that allowed potential partners to demonstrate their skills, values, and compatibility in ways that helped ensure successful long-term relationships. Parents and community elders played important roles in these processes, not as controlling authorities, but as advisors and facilitators who helped young people navigate the complex social and economic considerations that affected partnership decisions. Marriage arrangements weren't just personal choices. They were economic alliances that affected the prosperity and stability of extended families and entire communities. The evening hours provided opportunities for the kind of extended discussion and negotiation that allowed these arrangements to develop in ways that balanced individual desires with community needs. But even beyond courtship and marriage, the evening hours provided opportunities for the kind of personal growth and individual expression that were essential for human flourishing. People used this time for artistic pursuits, intellectual development, and spiritual practices that enriched their lives while also contributing to the cultural wealth of their communities. The artistic activities weren't just hobbies. They were sophisticated creative practices that required years of training and constant refinement. Painters, sculptors, and other visual artists used evening hours to develop techniques, experiment with materials, and create works that served both aesthetic and functional purposes in their communities. Musicians and poets used this time to compose new works, refine their performance skills, and explore creative possibilities that pushed the boundaries of their artistic traditions while remaining connected to the cultural values that gave their work meaning and social relevance. But perhaps most importantly, the evening hours provided time for the kind of reflection and contemplation that allowed individuals to process their experiences, understand their place in the larger community, and develop the wisdom and perspective that made them effective contributors to the collective well-being. This personal development wasn't just individual self-improvement. It was community investment that strengthened the human resources available for addressing collective challenges and pursuing shared goals. Communities recognized that individual growth contributed to collective prosperity, and they structured their social systems to support and encourage personal development in ways that benefited everyone. The seasonal variations in evening activities reveal another layer of sophistication in Egyptian social organization. Different times of year brought different opportunities and challenges that required adaptive responses from individuals and communities. During the flood season, when outdoor work was limited, evening hours might be extended into elaborate festivals and celebrations that could last for days. These weren't just parties. They were community-building exercises that strengthened social bonds, resolved accumulated tensions, and provided opportunities for the kind of intensive cultural transmission that preserved traditional knowledge while allowing for innovation and adaptation. During planting and harvest seasons, when daytime work was intensive and urgent, evening activities might be more focused on rest and recovery, but they still included the essential social and cultural functions that maintained community cohesion and individual well-being. The ability to adapt these social patterns to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential functions demonstrates a level of cultural sophistication that allowed Egyptian civilization to persist through centuries of environmental, political, and economic changes that destroyed less adaptable societies. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Egyptian evening life was how it balanced individual needs with collective requirements in ways that created sustainable communities that could thrive over long periods of time. The social structures that emerged during these evening hours weren't imposed from above by authorities. They developed organically through the daily interactions of people who understood that their individual well-being depended on the health and prosperity of their communities. This understanding created social systems that were both flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances and stable enough to provide the predictability and security that allowed individuals to plan for the future and invest in long-term relationships and projects. The evening hours also provided opportunities for the kind of intercom community interaction that connected local Egyptian communities to the broader civilization and to external trade networks that brought goods, ideas, and people from across the known world. Traveling merchants, visiting craftsmen, religious pilgrims and government officials often participated in these evening social activities, bringing news, ideas, and perspectives from other regions that enriched local communities while also connecting them to larger networks of information and opportunity. These interactions weren't just casual social exchanges. They were essential components of the communication systems that allowed Egyptian civilization to maintain coherence across vast distances and diverse environmental conditions. The information that flowed through these informal networks complemented the formal communication systems maintained by government and religious authorities, creating redundant information pathways that ensured that important knowledge reached all parts of Egyptian society. The cultural exchange that occurred during these evening interactions also contributed to the continuous evolution and refinement of Egyptian civilization, allowing local innovations to spread throughout the kingdom while also bringing external ideas and techniques that enhanced Egyptian capabilities and opportunities. But perhaps most importantly, these evening social activities provided the foundation for the kind of community resilience that allowed Egyptian civilization to survive and prosper through periods of political instability, environmental challenges, and economic disruption that would have destroyed less socially cohesive societies. The social bonds formed during these daily evening gatherings created networks of mutual support and cooperation that could be activated during emergencies, providing the collective response capabilities that were essential for community survival in a challenging environment. The knowledge systems maintained through these evening educational activities preserved the technical expertise and cultural wisdom that allowed communities to adapt to changing circumstances, while maintaining their essential character and values. The conflict resolution mechanisms that operated during these social gatherings prevented minor disputes and tensions from escalating into serious conflicts that could disrupt community functioning and threaten collective security. As we delve deeper into the complexity of ancient Egyptian evening life, we begin to understand that these weren't just people trying to survive in a harsh environment. They were sophisticated social beings who had created cultural systems that supported both individual fulfillment and collective prosperity in ways that modern societies are still trying to achieve. Their evening routines reveal people who understood that human well-being required more than just adequate food and shelter. It required meaningful social relationships, opportunities for personal growth, creative expression, and participation in something larger than individual survival. The sophistication of their social organization, the depth of their cultural knowledge, and the effectiveness of their community building practices challenge our assumptions about what ancient peoples were capable of achieving and suggest that we might have something to learn from their approaches to organizing human communities. But the evening hours were just one part of a daily cycle that included sleep patterns and morning preparations that were equally sophisticated and equally essential for the functioning of Egyptian civilization. The way Egyptians managed the transition between waking and sleeping hours reveals another dimension of their understanding of human needs and their ability to create social systems that supported optimal human functioning. The preparation for sleep wasn't just a matter of lying down when exhaustion overcame them. It was a carefully managed process that recognized the importance of rest for physical health, mental well-being, and spiritual balance. Egyptian sleeping arrangements reflected both practical considerations about climate and security and sophisticated understanding of how physical environment affected sleep quality and overall health. Their beds weren't just places to collapse at the end of exhausting days. They were carefully designed systems that provided comfort, support, and protection in ways that maximized rest quality while also reflecting social status and cultural values. The materials, construction techniques, and decorative elements of Egyptian beds reveal technological sophistication and artistic sensibility that challenges our assumptions about ancient manufacturing capabilities. But even more remarkably, Egyptian sleep practices included recognition of the psychological and spiritual dimensions of rest that modern sleep science is only beginning to understand. Their bedtime routines included practices designed to process the day's experiences, prepare the mind for restorative sleep, and maintain the spiritual connections that they believed were essential for individual and community well-being. The dreams that occurred during sleep weren't just random mental activity. They were considered important sources of information, guidance, and spiritual communication that required careful attention and interpretation. Egyptians developed sophisticated systems for understanding and responding to dream experiences that integrated psychological insight with spiritual belief in ways that provided practical guidance for daily life decisions. As morning approached and the cycle began again, Egyptians didn't just wake up randomly and stumble into another day. They engaged in carefully structured transition processes that prepared them physically, mentally, and spiritually for the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. These morning routines weren't just personal habits. They were cultural practices that connected individuals to their communities, their traditions, and their understanding of their place in the larger cosmic order that gave meaning and purpose to their daily activities. The morning prayers, offerings, and ritual activities that began each day weren't empty ceremonies. They were psychological preparation techniques that helped people approach their daily responsibilities with the confidence, focus, and commitment necessary for effective functioning in demanding environments. But perhaps most remarkably, these morning routines included planning and goal-setting activities that helped individuals coordinate their daily activities with the needs and activities of their families, their communities, and the larger economic and social systems of which they were part. Egyptian daily life wasn't just a series of survival activities. It was a carefully orchestrated participation in a complex civilization that required sophisticated coordination between individuals, families, communities, and regional and national institutions. The daily routines we've been exploring weren't just personal habits. They were essential components of the social and economic systems that made Egyptian civilization possible. The morning planning activities that began each day included consideration of weather conditions, seasonal requirements, community obligations, family needs, and individual goals in ways that optimized both personal effectiveness and collective prosperity. These weren't simple to-do lists. They were strategic planning processes that took into account multiple variables and competing priorities in ways that would impress modern project managers. The coordination required to make this system work reveals organizational capabilities that challenge our assumptions about what ancient peoples could achieve without modern communication and information management technologies. Yet somehow, millions of Egyptians managed to coordinate their daily activities in ways that created and maintained one of history's most successful and longest-lasting civilizations. As we continue to explore the details of ancient Egyptian daily life, we begin to understand that these weren't just people who happened to live a long time ago. They were sophisticated human beings who had developed solutions to fundamental challenges of human organization that remain relevant today. Their approaches to community building, resource management, education, conflict resolution, and individual development offer insights that could inform modern efforts to create sustainable, equitable, and fulfilling human societies. But to fully understand these insights, we need to continue our exploration of the details of Egyptian daily life, examining not just what they did, but how they did it, and why their approaches were so effective at creating human flourishing in challenging circumstances. The coordination challenges faced by ordinary Egyptians reveal problem-solving abilities that would humble most modern communities. Consider the daily reality of a small farming village during a harvest season, when timing meant the difference between prosperity and starvation. Every family had to coordinate their individual harvesting activities with their neighbors, because Egyptian agriculture wasn't just about individual plots of land. It was about managing complex irrigation systems that served multiple families, coordinating labor exchanges that allowed smaller families to handle large harvests, and timing everything to take advantage of optimal weather conditions that might last only a few days. The village headman's daily routine during harvest season required him to balance dozens of competing demands while maintaining the social harmony that made cooperation possible. His morning began before anyone else's, walking through the village and the surrounding fields to assess conditions, identify potential problems, and plan the day's activities based on factors that range from soil moisture levels to family disputes that might affect work productivity. But here's what makes this truly remarkable. He had to do all of this without any of the communication technologies we take for granted. No phones, no radios, no written schedules that could be distributed to everyone involved. Instead, he relied on a sophisticated system of visual signals, verbal messages, and social protocols that had been refined over generations to maximize efficiency while minimizing misunderstandings. The signal systems alone were masterpieces of practical communication design. Different colored flags or banners indicated different types of activities or priorities. Drum patterns conveyed specific messages about timing, location, or resource needs. Even the positioning of everyday objects like pottery jars or farming tools could communicate important information to people who understood the local conventions. Children played crucial roles in these communication networks, serving as messengers who carried information between different work groups, different families, and different areas of the village territory. But they weren't just running around randomly delivering messages. They were trained in complex protocols that ensured accurate information transmission while also teaching them the organizational skills they would need as adults. A typical child messenger understood dozens of different message types, knew the priority levels that determined which messages took precedence, and could adapt their delivery methods based on the recipient's current activity and social status. They learned to read situations quickly, determining whether a message should be delivered immediately or waited until a more appropriate moment, whether it required private delivery or could be shared publicly, and whether it might need clarification or additional context. This training wasn't just practical education. It was character development that taught children about responsibility, discretion, and the importance of accurate communication for community well-being. By the time they reached adulthood, they possessed communication skills that made them effective participants in the complex social and economic networks that held Egyptian society together. The daily management of these communication networks reveals another layer of Egyptian organizational sophistication. Information flowed through multiple channels simultaneously, creating redundancy that prevented critical communications from being lost, while also allowing for verification and error correction that maintained accuracy and reliability. Formal channels carried official information from government authorities, religious leaders, and community officials. Informal channels carried personal communications, local news, and the kind of social information that helped people maintain relationships and coordinate their private activities. Emergency channels could override normal communication patterns when urgent situations required immediate community response. But perhaps most impressively, Egyptians developed feedback systems that allowed them to monitor the effectiveness of their communication networks and make adjustments when problems were identified. Village leaders regularly checked to ensure that important information had reached all intended recipients, that instructions were being understood and followed correctly, and that the communication systems were adapting effectively to changing circumstances. The daily maintenance of these systems required constant attention from people throughout the community. Messengers had to maintain their physical fitness and local knowledge. Signal operators had to keep their equipment in working condition and stay current with evolving protocols. Community leaders had to monitor information flow patterns and identify bottlenecks or failures that might disrupt essential coordination. This systematic approach to communication management extended to every aspect of Egyptian daily life, creating information networks that connected individual families to their local communities to regional centers, and regional centers to the national government and religious institutions that provided overall coordination for the entire civilization. The daily life of a regional message coordinator reveals just how sophisticated these systems had become. His responsibilities included managing multiple communication networks simultaneously, coordinating information flow between different types of organizations, and ensuring that critical information reached appropriate decision makers quickly enough to be useful for planning and problem solving. His morning routine included checking multiple information sources to identify developing situations that might require coordinated responses. He reviewed reports from local officials about everything from crop conditions to security concerns, from trade opportunities to resource shortages that might affect regional stability. But he also monitored informal information networks that carried rumors, gossip, and unofficial observations that sometimes provided early warning about problems that hadn't yet reached official attention. Distinguishing between reliable and unreliable informal information required sophisticated analytical skills and deep understanding of local social dynamics and information patterns. Once he had assessed the current information environment, he faced the complex challenge of determining which information needed to be transmitted to which recipients in what format and with what priority level. This wasn't just a matter of following predetermined procedures. It required strategic thinking about how different pieces of information might interact with each other and with ongoing activities in different parts of his region. The actual transmission process involved coordinating multiple messengers, multiple delivery methods, and multiple timing considerations that had to account for travel conditions, recipient availability, and the relative urgency of different communications. A single morning's work might involve sending urgent messages about flood conditions to agricultural communities, routine administrative reports to government officials, and personal communications that maintained the social relationships it's essential for effective regional coordination. But beyond these obvious duties, regional coordinators served as information analysts who identified patterns and trends that might not be visible to local officials focused on their immediate responsibilities. They looked for connections between seemingly unrelated events, early indicators of developing problems, and opportunities for coordinated action that could benefit multiple communities simultaneously. This analytical function was crucial for maintaining the stability and prosperity of Egyptian civilization because it allowed problems to be addressed before they became crises and opportunities to be exploited before they disappeared. The daily analytical work of these coordinators contributed to the strategic planning capabilities that allowed Egyptian leaders to manage a complex civilization effectively across centuries of changing conditions. The information processing techniques they used were remarkably sophisticated, involving systematic comparison of current conditions with historical patterns, identification of anomalies that might indicate developing problems, and projection of likely future developments based on current trends and known cause and effect relationships. They maintained detailed records that allowed them to track changes over time, identify seasonal patterns that affected planning and resource allocation, and document successful and unsuccessful responses to various types of challenges. These records weren't just administrative paperwork. They were strategic intelligence systems that informed decision at every level of Egyptian society. The daily record-keeping activities required not just clerical skills, but also analytical abilities that allowed coordinators to extract meaningful patterns from large amounts of detailed information. They had to identify which details were significant and which were routine, which patterns indicated important trends and which reflected normal variations, and which information required immediate action and which could be addressed through normal planning processes. But perhaps most remarkably, they had to do all of this analysis without computers, statistical software, or any of the information processing tools that modern analysts consider essential. Instead, they relied on mental models, systematic procedures, and collaborative analytical processes that distributed complex analytical tasks across multiple people with different expertise and perspectives. The collaborative aspects of Egyptian information analysis reveal another dimension of their organizational sophistication. Different analysts specialized in different types of information and different types of analysis, creating analytical networks that could handle far more complex problems than any individual analyst could manage alone. Economic analysts focused on trade patterns, resource availability, and production trends that affected regional prosperity and stability. Agricultural analysts monitored weather patterns, crop conditions, and farming practices that determined food security and rural economic conditions. Security analysts tracked political developments, population movements, and external threats that might require military or diplomatic responses. But these analysts didn't work in isolation. They participated in regular coordination meetings that allowed them to share information, compare analyses, and develop integrated assessments that informed strategic planning and policy decisions. These coordination processes weren't just information sharing sessions. They were collaborative analytical exercises that produced insights and understanding that no individual analyst could achieve independently. The daily routine of participating in these analytical networks required communication skills that went far beyond simple information transmission. Analysts had to present complex information clearly and concisely ask questions that elicited useful information from their colleagues, and participate in discussions that built shared understanding of complex situations and appropriate responses. They also had to maintain awareness of how their specialized analyses fit into broader strategic contexts, ensuring that their technical expertise contributed effectively to overall decision-making processes rather than creating analytical silos that missed important connections and implications. This systems thinking approach to analysis and planning was one of the key factors that allowed Egyptian civilization to maintain coherence and effectiveness across vast distances and long periods of time. By ensuring that specialized knowledge was integrated into broader understanding, Egyptians avoided the fragmentation and coordination failures that destroyed many other ancient civilizations. The daily implementation of these systems thinking approaches required organizational disciplines that were embedded in routine activities throughout Egyptian society. People at every level understood that their individual responsibilities were part of larger systems that required coordination and mutual support to function effectively. Farmers understood that their individual agricultural decisions affected community food security and regional economic stability. Craftsmen understood that their quality standards and production schedules affected trade relationships and community reputation. Merchants understood that their business practices affected regional prosperity and intercom community relations.